It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce our speakers this afternoon. The role of religion in the conflict in Northern Ireland, as well as in the peace process, has been a complex and multifaceted one. Religion obviously and increasingly served as an ethnic identity marker in Ireland, particularly that part which became Northern Ireland since post-Reformation times, with the sectarian divisions in the north becoming especially fraught throughout the 20th century, culminated in the conflict from the late 1960s onwards, which were described through a tragic euphemism as the Troubles. This final panel will help us draw together many of the themes and issues we've been engaged with over the past 2 days. Our conversation will explore some of the historical and demographic backdrop to the ethnic divisions in Ireland and how religion became an increasingly bitter flashpoint for sectarian conflict and violence in the 20th century. But more importantly, for the primary constructive focus of this conference, we also want to consider the role played by religious leaders and communities in seeking to overcome the violence and division, particularly the cross-community initiatives advocating greater rights, integration and peace. There were numerous heroic and moving stands taken by family members of the victims of the violence and victims themselves to reach out across religious divides. And we should not forget the story of religious communities in Ireland, including the North, is one that embraces a much richer variety than the binary oppositional Protestant and Catholic communities. Northern Ireland has enjoyed a wide variety of interchurch families embracing many parts of the Christian church, as well as members of other faith communities over the years. So first of all, I will introduce each speaker and then ask them to share some of their own reflections on the basis of their deep experiences of the North and of the issues we are focusing upon today: Northern Irish communities exiting the cycle of violence and division. In particular, the role of religion in being part of, indeed in many ways, a motivating factor behind the violence in Ireland, yet also the crucial role played by religion, and especially the Christian churches, in helping bring Northern Ireland towards peace. Then I will ask each speaker specific questions that will further allow us to hear more about some of the success stories, some of the tragedies, and some of the work that needs to be done. So it's my great pleasure to introduce, first of all, Paul Arthur, who is Professor of Politics Emeritus at the University of Ulster in Northern Ireland, where he was Director of the Graduate Programme in Peace and Conflict Studies, and also of the International Conflict Resolution Institute. The master's programme he created at the University of Ulster has brought so many overseas students who are able to draw on Paul's vast experience to work towards peaceful solutions in conflict zones of their home countries. Among other positions, he was Senior Fellow at the United States Institute of Peace here in DC, a Fulbright Scholar at Stanford University, and the Joan B. Kroc Peace Scholar at the University of San Diego, where we met. Previously, he also served as Visiting Distinguished Professor and Director of Peace Studies at Chapman University in the University of California. His 5 published books include Special Relationships, Britain, Ireland, and the Northern Ireland Problem. He's been a consultant on a number of international projects, including to the United Nations Research Institute in Social Development on Political Violence and the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee on the House of Commons on an inquiry in dealing with the past. He has directed a number of Track 2 peace initiatives for Northern Ireland politicians and has been closely involved in peace-building and problem-solving initiatives in Colombia, Guatemala, Macedonia, Nepal, Israel, Palestine, and Sri Lanka. Most recently, very recently, he has been the chair of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Commemoration Committee, which organised a series of major international events commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Movement. It culminated in a festival last weekend where the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, gave a very moving and profound speech. We are delighted Paul is also working with us here at Georgetown to organise an event commemorating civil rights in Northern Ireland and also its relationship with the United States civil rights movement. So we'll be looking at civil rights in transatlantic perspective here on December the 14th. Please keep that date free in your diaries. Finally, just this month, Paul was awarded the Peace Award from the Center for Citizen Peacebuilding at the University of California, Irvine. Please join me in welcoming Paul Arthur.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can I start by thanking the organisers for inviting me here? I don't say that out of courtesy. I say it because I'm as far removed from a theological background as you can get, and I've learned so much in the past 2 days. I really have learned a great deal, and I hope some of that will be reflected in what I have to say. But secondly, can I chastise the organisers? This is the only panel which actually has got a temporal theme, past, present, and future. You do not invite someone from Ireland and expect to get beyond the past. And I intend to live up to that. Let me try and put my remarks in some sort of context. I want to quote from a book that appeared in the early 1990s called Faith and Faction. Talking about the Northern Ireland problem, it said it is one of national identity and of religious habit, overlaid by distorted history, whereby the divisions of Ulster history derive predominantly, if not exclusively, from the inherited fear and detestation of Roman Catholicism from the Protestant community. That was in the early 90s. I would argue that that is no longer the case. And the best example I can give is to compare and contrast the visit of the Pope in 1979 and the visit of the Pope earlier this year. In 1979, the Pope was all about getting on his knees and crying for peace. In 2018, the Pope was trying to avoid all the sexual scandals that had hit the Irish Church. And, you know, serendipity plays a great role in conflict. And the serendipity of the collapse of the monolith of Roman Catholicism in Ireland was one of the things that drove us towards peace, because the Protestant community realized that, in fact, Catholicism wasn't necessarily monolithic, nor was it necessarily hierarchical. And the Protestant community, Irvine talks about them detesting Roman Catholicism, the Protestant community began to look at the Catholic community in a much more benign light. Let me just give you a couple of quotes from some of the actors. One is from a leader of the Ulster Volunteer Force in 1972, a man called Billy Mitchell. And Mitchell said, I may be a bad Christian, but I'm a good Protestant. Now, I say that because the assumption always has been that this is simply Catholic versus Protestant. John White, who wrote a great book called Interpreting Northern Ireland, described it this way. He said, it is because Protestants hate Catholics. It's not simply because Protestants hate Catholics and vice versa. It's also because Protestants hate Protestants and Catholics hate Catholics that the problem is so insoluble. So that the intra-ethnic became as important as the inter-ethnic. Another quote I want to use, because we are speaking about violence and non-violence, and as Gerard mentioned, I've been chairing the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Committee. We had a 40th anniversary, and the 40th anniversary is very much like an old comrades association where we clapped each other in the back and said what wonderful work we'd done. On the 50th, we've been much more reflective, and we've attempted to be much more inclusive. And I have been quoting from Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, Why We Can't Wait. And he argues that if, in fact, you're going to organize a campaign, there are 4 things that are necessary. First, you gather the data to prove that what you're going to engage in is justified. Secondly, you enter into negotiation. And on the assumption that that negotiation fails, thirdly, you go through a period of self-purification before you go into the final phase of non-violent direct action. And I raise that because we speak of political violence. We never were part of that third of self-purification. And that was one of our greatest problems. And it is something that we have to reflect on. Gerard mentions the Troubles. You know, we're talking about nearly 4,000 people dead, which was the equivalent of 500,000 people here in the United States, in a territory no larger than that of Rhode Island. So we really do need to reflect on what political violence meant to us. And so to try then move from that context, I really want to concentrate on just one event. And that is, actually it's 2 events, the hunger strikes of 1980-81. I say strikes because one was held in 1980 and collapsed 18th of December 1980 before they embarked on the second one. And I want to talk about that in the context of political violence and the role of, in particular, the Catholic Church. The historian Oliver McDonough, looking at 2 centuries of British-Irish relations, spoke about the 5 cycles of political violence in Ireland. And the last he described as that of Pádraig Pearse in 1916, the 1916 Rising. He described it as the religion of violent nationalism and the concept of generational witness, historic roles, and the supremacy of the gesture. The religion of violent nationalism and the concept of generational witness, historic roles, and the supremacy of the gesture. Because one of the things that I want to emphasize very strongly when you're talking about trying to exit violence is what I call symbolic capital, the role that violence played. And this is why I concentrate on the past. Because when George Mitchell, Senator George Mitchell, was asked to write a report on how we got decommissioning in Ireland in 1996, he wrote this report shortly before the IRA ceasefire broke down. He says, if the focus remains on the past will become the future, and that is something that no one can desire. And unfortunately for us, the past has always been present. And the beauty of the agreement in 1998 and the 20 years since then has been a first serious attempt to get away from the past, to get away from the binary tribalism that had gone on for centuries. Secondly, when the same historian, Oliver McDonough, when he looked at the role of the Catholic Church and political violence, he spoke about what he called a triple ambiguity. He said it was recessional, it was gestural, and it was a form of humanitarianism. When I say recessional, as all of you will know, there probably was no more Catholic country, perhaps with the exception of Poland, than Ireland, where the church had got absolute control. The one issue where the church did not control its flock was on the national question. And so the church always had to be very careful on how it dealt with the national question. So when I speak of the recessional, the church would, maybe 50 years after event, find some reason to say why it was justified. For example, the church in the present generation has been condemning throughout the Troubles the role of the IRA and comparing them with the noble men and women of the Irish Republican Army in the 1920s. That is recessional. They don't want to lose their flock. They have to show some sort of obeisance towards that flock, and that was one of the ways they handled it. Secondly, gestural. The church would make some gestures. They did not agree with what was happening, but they would make some sort of diplomatic maneuvers to allow their flock to stay on board. And thirdly, the humanitarian, which is really a compound embracing sympathy with the cause. And the classic example to me of humanitarianism occurred during the hunger strikes. Because, and this again is where the past is so important. And when I listened to the session on Latin America yesterday, particularly on Colombia, and I did some work in Colombia, and I remember someone saying to me in Colombia, said, you know, the difference between violence in Ireland and violence in Colombia is that in Colombia, we set out to kill. In Ireland, you set out to die. The whole concept of martyrology was so strong, and that is classically the case in the hunger strikes. Ireland is probably unique in the Western world. You know, there just isn't any tradition really in the Western world of hunger striking. You can go back maybe to the suffragettes in the beginning of the 20th century, or you can think of individuals such as Danilo Dolci in Sicily when he was fighting against the mafia. But in Ireland, before the hunger strikes in 1980-81, 12 Republicans had already gone to their deaths in that century. So it was a form of martyrology. And because it was a form of martyrology, it was much more easy to justify what they were doing. And this is where the symbolic capital comes into play. During the hunger strikes, they would start with the decade of the Rosary before they went into, demanding their rights. The imagery was that of the Pieta, the dying Christ, and the symbolism and the words used, no greater love hath a man than to lay down his life for his friends. And in that context, it is very, very difficult for an organization of the Catholic Church to break that hold that it had on the community. And as an example, when the first hunger strike collapsed, the prisoners put out a statement in which they very seriously condemned the Roman Catholic Church as being part of the establishment who had no concern for justice. And just by invoking justice, you're immediately bringing your flock on board. And so when the first hunger striker, Bobby Sands, when he went on hunger strike, something like 4,000 people come out to demonstrate in favor of him. When he died, 100,000 people come out. So the huge propaganda, the huge emotion around the hunger strike was that which really gave it the heft that it had. And so what I'm trying to say, let me just quote from the Sinn Féin statement after the first hunger strike. The Catholic hierarchy, and note said hierarchy because it wanted to make a distinction between the ordinary priest and those in control. The Catholic hierarchy has at all times been established by political considerations other than the Christian values of truth and justice. So immediately, they're on the side of the angels. And you have a political culture which is based on victimhood, a political economy of helplessness. And where you have victimhood, it becomes very, very difficult to make a distinction between who's a victim and who's a perpetrator. God is on your side. What you're doing is totally justified. And it was that which sustained the problem for so long, or sustained the campaign for so long. And secondly, using history. For example, in 1916, when the 1916 Rising had occurred, William Butler Yeats wrote a poem called The Red Rose Tree, where he talks about a conversation between the two of the leaders, Pádraig Pearse and James Connolly, where he says that it is the role of this generation to spill its blood into the land of Ireland so that a red rose tree would grow for the next generation. So when you have that sense of history built on a political culture of victimhood, it becomes extremely difficult to move beyond the past. The only way that the Catholic Church could condemn it was to appeal to the just war tradition. And the then Bishop of Down and Connor, Cathal Daly, who was a theologian, argued that the armed struggle failed the just war tradition on the grounds of competent authority and just means. So that battle between church and Republicans went on for a couple of generations, but there were individual priests who played a vital role in bringing the Republican movement towards peace. And what broke that cycle was the role of the international community. Again, some of the discussions yesterday, there is in the literature the notion of the ripe moment, when you have a hurting stalemate, when both sides decide that they can no longer continue, and where you have political leaders who've got the capacity to move things forward, and where you have a putative solution. Now, it's not a moment, it's a process. But we had our ripe moment beginning in the late 1980s, when Republicans began to engage with the church, with the Irish and British governments, and then began to move in the direction of peace. And when I quoted Billy Mitchell saying that I may be a bad Christian, but I'm a good Protestant, he represented a tradition which saw itself as being counter-terrorists. We are there because we're opposed to the terrorism of the IRA. Once the IRA lays down its arms, then we will do so. And so in 1994 and then again in 1998, that is precisely what happened, and that allowed us to move towards the present and the future. And there I'll leave it.
Thanks very much, Paul. So it's my great pleasure now to introduce David Toombs, who has come a very long way to be here. He's the Howard Patterson Professor of Theology and Public Issues and the Director of the Centre for Theology and Public Issues at the University of Otago in New Zealand. This is the very first research centre in New Zealand to examine political, social and economic issues from a theological perspective. David has a long-standing interest in contextual and liberation theologies, and amongst his many other publications is the author of the book Latin American Liberation Theology. Presently, which means he hasn't just got off a long-haul flight, he's a visiting fellow at the Centre of Theological Inquiry at Princeton University. His current research focuses on religion, violence and public theology, and especially on Christian responses to gender-based violence, sexual abuse and torture. Previously, David was a lecturer in theology at the University of Roehampton in London, and more importantly for our gathering these 2 days, he spent 13 years living and working in Belfast, Northern Ireland. He was Professor of Conflict Resolution and Reconciliation for the Irish School of Ecumenics, Trinity College, Dublin, and directing its pioneering MA in Reconciliation Studies in Belfast, which brought together students from all communities across Ireland, as well as from all around the globe. Please join me in welcoming David Toombs.
Thanks, Gerard, for that very generous invitation and introduction. Thanks to Jose and colleagues here at Georgetown for this opportunity to speak. Thanks to you all for such a full room on a Friday afternoon when I'm sure there are other things you could be doing in the sunshine. We've had some wonderful analytic presentations over the last 2 days, and rather than offer another analytics session, I thought I would really just tell a story. If we have time, I'll tell 2 stories, a short one at the end, but the first one a rather long one. I should start by saying it's not typical of the violence in Northern Ireland. So if you're not familiar with Northern Ireland, don't take this as representative. I tell it because I think it is important and it is illuminating around the issue of religious imagination and exiting violence. And if you're familiar with literature of the sociological imagination going back to C. Wright Mills, or more recently in Peacebuilding, the moral imagination that John Paul Lederach and others have written about, it's perhaps an opportunity to reflect on the notion of religious imagination and what that might do. I should warn you, though, that it's religious imagination used in a negative way. So it's to illustrate the idea of what I'm calling religious imagination, but it's not holding up as a good model. I hope there'll be time just to reflect on a more positive model of religious imagination. Religious imagination and exiting violence, a Belfast crucifixion. In the early hours of 2nd of November 2002, on the outskirts of Belfast, Harry McCartan was severely beaten and left in the dark, nailed to a wooden stile on a wooden fence, with his arms outstretched to make the sign of a cross. 6-inch nails had been driven through his hands, and then bent round the back of the wood so that he could not free himself. He barely survived his injuries. Firemen had to be summoned to cut through the fence to release him, and he was taken to hospital with his hands still nailed to the wood. His legs had been broken as part of the attack, so he could not properly support himself. Newspapers reported what had happened under the headline, "Crucifixion." His face was so badly disfigured that when his father saw him, he was only able to identify his son by a tattoo on his son's arm with the name of his son's 5-year-old daughter. His jaw was broken and his speech was heavily distorted when he tried to speak to journalists a few days later. The attack took place in the low-income Protestant area known as Seymour Hill and was widely seen as the work of loyalist paramilitaries. McCartan was a 23-year-old Catholic who lived in the nearby low-income nationalist neighbourhood of Polglass. He had recently been released from a spell in prison for car crimes and had previously been beaten by loyalist paramilitaries with hammers for joyriding, taking somebody else's car and driving away, typically as high speed, as recreational entertainment. The police reported that crucifixions had featured in some similar punishments before, but never with such severity. Nonetheless, at least some people in Seymour Hill, which is where it happened, approved of what had gone on, and graffiti appeared on a wall nearby which read, "Crucify the Hoods, South Belfast, Ulster Freedom Fighters," the name of a loyalist group. Punishment attacks against people accused of antisocial behaviour had been relatively common occurrences in areas of the city plagued by crime and controlled by either loyalist or Republican paramilitaries. After the violence of the so-called Troubles, so approximately 1969 to 1998, Northern Ireland's social transition towards a new and more peaceful society remained slow. Many of the neighbourhoods which had been most affected by earlier political violence remained under the de facto control of paramilitaries. Punishment beatings helped paramilitaries to impose their authority and assert social control over the areas which they claimed to represent and defend. The victims had more usually been victims of their own community, their own side of the religious divide, rather than belonging to the other side. The day before, a related loyalist organisation, the Ulster Defence Association in North Belfast, had shot one of their own political representatives in both legs in North Belfast, known locally as a kneecapping. It was apparently a punishment for his maligning of the organisation, but by saying it was against the peace process. So because one of their own representatives had spoken out about them for not being fully committed to the peace process, he had himself been punishment beaten. In 2001, 3 years after the 1998 Good Friday Peace Agreement, Belfast was still a deeply divided city with high levels of sectarian violence. The then British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, was quoted as saying that reports of the attack on Macartan made him physically sick, and he used it to condemn both loyalist and Republican paramilitary violence. Yet despite the political and media interest in Macartan's crucifixion, there are plenty of questions about that night which cannot be answered. Was the attack on Macartan a conventional paramilitary punishment for antisocial behaviour taken to an extreme level, or was its ferocity and form in some part motivated by an element of sectarian anti-Catholic hatred? If it was sectarian, was the choice of crucifixion in some way influenced by a sense that the crucifix is seen as more a Catholic symbol than a Protestant symbol, since Protestants typically use the bare cross? Was there some perverse religious imagination reference to Catholic images of suffering in this Protestant paramilitary punishment? To what extent the nature of the attack and the use of crucifixion was sectarian will probably never be known. In any case, Macartan himself said he remembered nothing about the attack and thought he was dreaming when he woke up in hospital. It's reported that he broke down in tears when he finally saw the photos of his own disfigured face in the newspapers and realised what had happened. One of the legacies of the Troubles is that not knowing is a familiar difficulty. Almost any story about what really happened is likely to be disputed and contested, and the truth is hard to judge. There are usually at least two versions of what happened, and these tend to divide along political lines. Just as the geographic spaces in the city are divided, in many cases with so-called peace walls dividing neighbourhoods, so likewise perceptions and public discourse is divided, and the motives behind what happens are often starkly different, or seen as starkly different. In this particular case, the police downplayed the suggestion of a sectarian motive for the attack, whereas Macartan's father believed that sectarianism was an important part of what happened. Now, my suggestion is that regardless of an explicitly sectarian motivation, the McCartan case offers insight into where intolerance can lead and how this can be expressed in the cruelty of crucifixion. But let me offer 4 reflections on it as a story. First, although the conflict in Northern Ireland was never a directly religious conflict, nonetheless, religious elements were always present in a myriad of complex ways, and post-conflict remain present in the violence that's continued in some forms post-peace agreement. And this religious presence includes giving layers of meaning to violence, which can only be properly understood where the religious dimension is acknowledged and religious imagination is considered. So I think a religious imagination may well have been behind the McCartan crucifixion and needs to be part of any proper understanding of it. Second, as already noted, the religious element might sometimes be obvious and might sometimes be disputed and contested. And when it is disputed, that division tends to divide neatly between Protestant and Catholic. This is in part because what constitutes religion varies. Catholic imagination is more likely to see religious significance around sacrifice and the crucifix. And when Paul was talking about Bobby Sands and the way that that captured Catholic imagination, even if the church hierarchy distanced themselves from this, I think that's one of the things which was going on there, a Christological imagination around Bobby Sands as the suffering victim. Whereas, of course, Protestants are unlikely to pick up on those religious aspects and have that religious imagination. Hence, almost everything is contested, even the terminology of, say, the Good Friday Agreement. The terminology of Good Friday Agreement is typically Catholic. Protestants will resist that terminology and prefer the more straightforward Belfast Agreement. Third, as was said yesterday, it would be naive to think that a successful transition and exit from the violence in Northern Ireland can be achieved by simply ignoring the interface of religion and violence. And the same goes for other conflicts where religion has played a complex role. It's better to seek a deeper understanding of how religious elements have worked to promote or sustain violence, and how religious resources can serve to challenge violence and to promote a religious imagination orientated to peace, reconciliation, and human rights. And fourth and finally, there's a need for that religious imagination, the creative religious imagination to promote peace, to be at least as strong as the destructive religious imagination that I think was behind Harry McCartan's crucifixion. To be that strong, though, does not necessarily mean being grandiose and dramatic. Let me end with a quick second story that suggests a more positive religious imagination orientated to peace. The area in Belfast that we lived in when we were lucky enough to live in Belfast had escaped the worst of the Troubles. But of course it had been marked by political killings, by murders and executions. The local clergy fellowship, an ecumenical clergy fellowship, Catholic and Protestant ministers, made a decision early in the Troubles that when there was a killing in their neighbourhood, the first visit to the family would always be both the priest and the minister. They would not visit their own community without the presence of the other. Now, this, in some ways, is a very small gesture, but in other ways, it was a tremendously powerful, imaginative, creative Christian witness. Because it meant instead of reinforcing the element of division, the very first sort of official religious presence was trying to de-escalate that division rather than reinforce it. For the priest or the minister, if they were visiting, as it were, out of their community, the animosity of the community would be called down upon them, but they were given safety and protection by the presence of their fellow minister or the fellow priest. And therefore, in a quiet but very significant way, religion was able, in an imaginative, understated solidarity presence, to offer an exit from violence, which in some ways probably helped that community escape the very worst violence and divisions of the Troubles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Well, last and certainly not least, most certainly not least, Lisa Tracy is our final speaker, who presently co-leads St Brendan's in the City, very Irish-sounding parish, but it's actually on Capitol Hill, an Anglican parish. Originally from Northern Ireland, Lisa has spent 18 years at the intersection of theory and practice, training, supporting and promoting reconciliation in and through education and faith communities. As an education and development officer at the Peace and Reconciliation NGO called Cooperation Ireland, Lisa developed relationship building strategies used throughout the island of Ireland and in transatlantic partnerships with American schools. At Queen's University Belfast, Lisa was the methods tutor for the postgraduate certificate in education, history and politics course. There she equipped trainee teachers to teach controversial issues in high schools. Lisa was also the Education Development Officer for Queen's 3 Centres of Excellence in Teaching and Learning, partnering with academic staff to refine and disseminate innovative approaches across the university. Passionate about reflexive practice, Lisa now uses her professional experience to shape adult formation, children's ministry, and pastoral care in a local parish setting. Please join me in welcoming Lisa Tracy.
Thank you very much, Jared. Good evening. Good evening. I have 2 small children. I've been up from a very early time. Time is another element in my life. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you very much for your very kind invitation. I'm going to pick up where David left off. So I grew up in the Protestant community in Northern Ireland, as you can tell from my accent. Born and reared in Lisburn, so about 8 miles outside Belfast. And I just want to offer a few reflections, I guess centred in that community and some of my personal experiences from growing up in Northern Ireland. And one of the greatest challenges for churches is that they're full of people. It's terribly inconvenient, right? And they'd be very easy to lead and very easy to manipulate if it wasn't so full of people. And I don't know how aware you are of Umberto Eco's work. In 2008, he gave a lecture at Bologna University. And the lecture was entitled Inventing the Enemy. And he makes what is, for me, a pretty scary ontological assertion that we need another, we need an enemy in order to be able to define ourselves. And if we don't have one of those enemies, we'll invent one. Okay? And only by overcoming an enemy can we really measure our own true worth. And that was certainly the experience for a lot of the Protestant community in Northern Ireland. We worked out who we were by what we weren't. So in other words, we didn't actually know what we were a lot of the time. Now, having to have an enemy creates a terrible conundrum for an institution and for individuals claiming to follow Jesus of Nazareth, who in Matthew 5 tells us to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. An interesting cognitive conflict. Okay. And that conflict becomes more pronounced when the enemy is very real and very clear. Everybody in Northern Ireland, we get it by osmosis, I guess. We're very clear tells. You learn from a very young age how to tell where everybody's from. For some people, that's a very real need for survival. For others, it's about social strata and social positioning. But by name, and if the name was a bit wishy-washy, could be either side of the community, then you would work out, well, where did you go to school? segregated education helps. And then if that was it a little bit, maybe it was an independent grammar school and you weren't sure, you would have another tell by what sport you played. Okay. And I learnt it from my family. Don't ever remember being sat down and told it. But everybody knew how to read everybody else. Okay. And the problem for the churches was that they were being led by people like me, everyday people who had the same conundrum of needing an enemy, that if we take that as sociological reality. And they were also people who were afraid in lots of ways. So it is true that the Protestant churches, I'll stick with them for now, were proponents of peace. They were condemners of violence. They buried the dead. But they also supported and upheld discrimination, and at times actively encouraged the hatred of the other. So despite this Matthew 5 call, there was the mixed message often from the pulpit. Basil de Van der Klok wrote an interesting book called The Body Keeps the Score. I don't know if you've read it. And it's about the brain, the mind, and the body in the healing of trauma. And he makes an assertion that well-functioning people are able to accept individual differences and acknowledge the humanity of others. I think one of the things that has gone a little unacknowledged from the Northern Ireland conflict as far as the churches are concerned is that the clergy were very often the holder of the secrets. They knew things. They saw things. They were told stories. The story that you shared today. The clergy knew the graphic details. And they were as traumatized, if not more traumatized, than their parishioners. And it's really hard to lead someone where you can't go yourself. Because there wasn't, and there is still not really, a mindset of that holistic. I caught the end of the women's session just before lunch. And that idea of a holistic approach to humanoids, where it can't just be about the role that you play, but actually, let's look at mental health problems. Let's look at the support. Let's look at dealing with the past in lots of different ways. And that hasn't happened, certainly for clergy in Northern Ireland. And it hasn't happened for the wider public either. So it's very hard to go, and very hard to move entire institutions towards peace. There were people of faith who took this loving your enemies very seriously. We had some who were, in the Protestant community, very public about it. So let's take just one example. We have Lord Robin Eames. In 1975, he was made the Anglican Bishop of Derry and Raphoe, a cross-border Anglican parish in the Church of Ireland. And he caused controversy from the outset by inviting to his consecration his equally young Catholic counterpart, Edward Daly. And everybody was like, what are you doing? But he started the way he meant to go on in some ways as well. He then went on to be the Primate of all Ireland. And throughout the Troubles, he was Primate of all Ireland from 1986 to 2006. And throughout the Troubles was kind of like a political voice in many ways. He started out as a lawyer. He's now in the House of Lords, always a consummate politician. But he spoke in condemnation of violence on both sides of the community and was vilified for it in his own community at times. These public faces like Robin Eames also had very private conversations, had private relationships. And there were also people who were in our house get called the nameless and the faceless. I don't know of any conflict around the world that doesn't need nameless and faceless peacemakers. People with this creativity, this courage to be generous listeners, the courage to sit round a kitchen table with somebody from the other community, the courage to welcome them into your business, to share the shop floor with them, to do life with them. And it was courageous because very often their own community rejected them. They were almost like, they were Christ-like, weren't they, in that just as he was abandoned in that self-sacrificial moment on the cross of abandonment, he experiences abandonment, so they too were often abandoned by their own people. One could argue, though, that it was in these very intimate places that wasn't in front of the media that peace was actually conceived. I spent a number of years, as Jared said, working for Cooperation Ireland, and our whole premise was the contact hypothesis. That it's only when we put a name to a label that we have any hope of moving the process forward. Only when we know somebody from the other community that we can actually make any ways to reconciliation. And for me, it's a little bit like a theology of Easter Saturday. Right? You've got the self-sacrificial move of meeting with someone, building a relationship with somebody from the other community. It's like that of Good Friday. And you have to pass through Easter Saturday. There has to be death in order for there to be resurrection. By 1998, we had the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement that was referenced earlier on. It was an agreement of its time. You know, we were by that stage over 3,600 people had been killed, thousands had been injured. There wasn't any family in Northern Ireland that escaped some form of PTSD. And we'd suffered a lot. Hearing you tell the story, David, produces almost a visceral reaction in me. And I can feel it, my heart rate started to go. My hands started to sweat, because I remember it. Because you don't see images like that and come out unchanged. We're all scarred by it in some way. The people who made those self-sacrificial moments of reaching across the divide in the nameless, faceless spaces, for me, were the people that allowed peace to be conceived in Northern Ireland. And by the time we got to 1998, we had men who were like the midwives of the peace process. They were able to bring to birth, at a moment in time, a form of peace. But we couldn't have got there without all those other little pieces, both the public and the private. Peace, this idea of living harmoniously with mutual respect and dignity, doesn't happen overnight. That would be lovely. If you fast forward from 1998 to 2007 with the instigation of the consultative group on the past that was led by two former churchmen, Lord Eames, that I talked about earlier on, and a former priest, Dennis Bradley. And they were tasked to come up with how we were going to address the past, which is to Paul's point from earlier on. And that was rejected. That report was rejected in 2010 over the issue of parity of esteems of victims. So Eames Bradley had suggested that every family who had a victim from the Troubles would receive £12,000 compensation, in inverted commas. And people couldn't take it. The phrase was that one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. Because even 10 years after the Good Friday Agreement, we didn't know each other. We couldn't see the humanity in each other. We were still in Good Friday. We'd had our Good Friday. We were still in Easter Saturday. We were dead. You fast forward to now, and we're really no further on. I'm very sad to say. The fact that we haven't had functioning government for 2 years in Northern Ireland can be read as just the conflict in another iteration. We still can't see each other. We still can't see our humanity in each other. And that for me is the burning question that we face in Northern Ireland. How are we going to move out of Easter Saturday and into Easter Sunday? What's new life and resurrection in Northern Ireland going to look like? I don't know. Jared, do you know? No. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Lisa. 3 very moving reflections. Some of the reflections put me in mind of the story where somebody was asked in Northern Ireland, what's your religion? And they said, I'm an atheist. And the next question was, are you a Protestant atheist or a Catholic atheist? I'm going to ask, first of all, give everybody a chance to answer an individual question, and then I'll ask some more general questions and then open things up to the floor. So the first question is for you, Paul. Tell us a bit more about the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, about why it was so important to commemorate the 50th anniversary the way you did so inclusively and wonderfully last weekend. And what's the work that remains to be done in civil rights in Ireland and indeed here in the US and elsewhere? In particular, what do you think we might learn and achieve in the commemoration we're planning here at Georgetown on December the 14th with the Global Irish Studies Initiative and in partnership with you in Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland Bureau, the Irish Embassy and other Irish and Irish American groups?
I did mention that we had a 40th anniversary committee, and someone said, well, why are you having a 40th anniversary? And someone said, well, we may not be alive for the 50th anniversary. And, you know, we went into it in that sort of trivial manner. The 50th anniversary, from the outset, we said we have to be inclusive. We don't belong to any political party. I was once a member of the Northern Ireland Labour Party, but that was over 50 years ago. I was always on the left. And so we've drawn people from across the political spectrum, former communists, former unionists, people of no political affiliation whatsoever. And we also decided we needed some patrons to lend their names to it. And among our patrons is Joan Baez, who happened to be in Belfast, and we went along and said, will you become a patron? And she said, yes, of course I'll become a patron. And Michael Longley, who's a wonderful poet. And again, the patrons were meant, and we have a couple of members of the House of Lords, including someone who's been in here this past couple of days, Baroness May Blood. So we were sending out a message in the composition of our committee and of our patrons. Secondly, we were very, very conscious of how do you deal with the past, and there's been a lot of talk going on, and we realized that what we've got is a negative peace, and our business was how do you move towards a positive peace. And thirdly, we were very conscious, at least my generation, when we set out, we were very conscious of what happened here in the United States. Our anthem was "We Shall Overcome." Our hero was Martin Luther King. And that's why I say we failed, because we failed on the self-purification. And so we had to address that question as well. And at the very outset, we've had something like 24 public meetings this year and 2 private meetings. And the private meetings were with members of the Protestant Unionist Loyalist community. They said we did not want this to be seen as a threat to you. We wanted to include you. And so we held our meetings, for example, in Protestant churches. So I think that the best thing we have done is to be both inclusive and reflective. I think that the worst thing that we haven't done. The worst thing is just that past. There are people who will tell you that the troubles started because the civil rights movement started. That the civil rights movement was a Trojan horse for the IRA. Ian Paisley used to say, CRA, Civil Rights Association, he said, if you twist that C, you get I. CRA equals IRA. And I reject entirely, I think that the civil rights movement was totally justified because conditions were very bad for Catholics and also for working class Protestants. But working class Protestants could not nor would not become part of it. And we made efforts to get them to join. I remember, for example, I was brought up in the Bogside in Derry, going into a fountain area to try and encourage Protestants, but their leaders wouldn't let them do so. So that's really what we've been about. And I think we have been more inclusive. I think we've been more reflective. And I think that we now need to continue this work. For example, someone suggested the other day, we need to go and talk to the police. The police were our enemy, the Royal Ulster Constabulary. But we need to get that constituency on board as well as every other one. And we are very, very conscious that, for example, last weekend, 5th of October, was the 50th anniversary of the march that started it all in Duke Street in Derry. And we deliberately decided not to have a march, whereas Sinn Féin did have a march. And what Sinn Féin are concerned with now is creating their own narrative. Someone once said, it's not what happened in the past that matters, it is how it is remembered. And they are now creating a narrative to justify all that the IRA was involved in. And we need to have that counter-narrative which demonstrates that there is a way for non-violence, and I hope that's what we're about.
Thanks very much, Paul. Lisa, you've worked with local church communities and have educated the educators of both sides of Northern Ireland's divides. What signs of hope did you see emerge from your work on both fronts, i.e. the attention to the local context and to those who bring about transformations in the perspectives, minds and aspirations of tomorrow's generations?
Nice, easy question, thank you. I remember being in a boys' Protestant school in North Belfast. And I was there, they were, I was supporting them in their relationship with an interesting new relationship with a Catholic school in the Republic of Ireland. And I would meet with the principal and we would talk about some of the challenges of getting them on the bus, as we would call it. Because if you could get them on the bus and get them over the border, it was progress. And he told a story of the first time, he was a newly appointed principal, and the boys, as they're called, came and lifted him one night. And they took him away to an undisclosed location, and they were like, we're going to tell you how you're going to run the school. And he went, I don't think so. So when they're on school grounds, they're mine. Whatever you do and however you influence them outside school, that's up to you and that's up to their parents. But on school grounds, they're mine. And he was one of so many principals and teachers where schools were the safe havens, where people tried to shield young people from the influence and to give them an alternative and to say that life doesn't have to be this way. I used to work for, as you said, for Cooperation Ireland, and we brought schools together in Northern Ireland, but schools together in the Republic of Ireland. And it was courageous for a lot of those schools to do that, because a lot of those Protestant kids had never met a Catholic, had no context in which to meet one. So if you can't meet somebody, they can be made out to have two heads and four legs and whatever, you know, because if you think about how the enemy's always created in literature, they're always ugly, aren't they? The enemy can never be somebody attractive or somebody that has something in common with you. They become distorted because that's the seed of hate. And so the schools were in many ways the forerunners. They were able to say things that the parents couldn't say. And they continue to do that. And in terms of curriculum, having things like citizenship education and the introduction of thinking skills and personal capabilities, we're trying to equip our young people to think more critically, which is something that we haven't been terribly good at in Northern Ireland. Part of it is that our education system is constructed around the test. You know, we get credit for what we know, not for what we don't know. Right? So if what you don't know is the place of uncertainty and the place of weakness, then what dies is curiosity. But you need curiosity in order to reach across a divide, to meet somebody that's different from you, and to have that courage. And so there have been some curriculum initiatives that will, I think, in time help to make that change.
That's great. Thanks very much, Lisa. Yeah. David, you're the director of the very first New Zealand, in fact, I think it might be the first Antipodean institution that explores political, social, and economic issues from a theological perspective. Why are such institutions necessary, and how important do you think public theology, political theology, and initiatives that explore religion and public life are today, especially for overcoming conflict, but also in relation to the many other pressing social and political challenges of our times?
So New Zealand is a remarkably secular culture, and it takes great pride in the fact that it's a secular culture, but doesn't have a very clear sense of what that actually means. So for most people, the sense of it being secular is that religion should be kept out of the public sphere. It's a largely backward sort of thing that if you're going to indulge with, you should indulge in private or on a Sunday with consenting adults. And that's about the limit of the religious sphere in New Zealand. And what's interesting about that narrative is that's largely untrue to New Zealand history, that the idea of a secular New Zealand was not to privilege any particular religion, particularly the establishment Anglican religion of Britain, that there should be religious freedom, not a secular space. But in New Zealand, the idea that religion has a positive contribution to make to almost anything is met with a degree of scorn. So in Ireland, where I was before moving to New Zealand, everyone would have known what theology was. They might have had negative views about it, but you didn't need to explain what it was to be a professor of theology. Whereas it's quite possible, if you tell somebody you're a professor of theology, they're utterly bewildered by this thing. You know, what is that? It's something to do with rocks or something. Is that what it is? They've heard of geology, but not theology, but it must be like that. And one of the consequences of that, of course, is theology, as it were, religious imagination, doesn't disappear because people say they're secular. They just don't have any tools to make it transparent, to critically interrogate it, to think about, well, what makes a good or bad theology? And therefore, all sorts of religious ideas, or perhaps pseudo-religious ideas which aren't named as religious, can surface and circulate without being made available for critical interrogation. So one of the things I do in New Zealand is try to bring out the religious foundations, values, shaping issues. And the work that was done in Ireland is very important for that. And it's very important because one of the principles we always worked with was that whatever is part of the problem has to be part of the solution, or has to be addressed as part of the solution. The approach that you deal with the religious problem by ignoring it or setting it aside just doesn't make any sense under any circumstances, other than that's the easy option for people who don't feel comfortable with religion. Now, one of the interesting things now in New Zealand is our neighbours are Pacific Islands, and in some of those Pacific Islands, Christianity is extraordinarily strong. So Samoa, where I've been doing work this year on violence against women, 99% plus of the population identify as Christian. It's all but compulsory. And yet the New Zealand Foreign Affairs Ministry are very uncertain as to, well, how would you bring a a religious engagement on an issue like violence against women. So one of the things I think theology can do in this is provide a critical analysis, but more importantly, perhaps, to provide a creative, transformative resource and imagination for intervention as well.
That's great. Thank you, David. So a question for all of you, and then we'll open up for some questions from the floor. We all know Northern Ireland's had no power share in executive now for the best part of 2 years. We know the fraught divisions that have hardened across the divides of the two largest political parties in recent years, the DUP and Sinn Féin. That great generation of the peace process is moving on. We know the disaster zone that is called Brexit is posing multiple threats to everything that has been achieved in the last 3 decades of effort for peace and coexistence. What do you think are the biggest threats to lasting peace in Ireland? What do you think can move things forward? And where do you see the momentum for breaking this logjam coming from? Do you think the churches have an active role still to play here? Or have social and secularizing trends, along with ecclesial and ecclesiological developments, negated the influences of the church too much? So quite a bit to mull over there. But so first of all, what is the biggest threat to peace, and where's the momentum going to come from to make sure that peace is sustained?
I should say I've spent all my life in Northern Ireland. I mean, I was one of a family. There were 9 other children, and all the rest of them left Northern Ireland. The usual, couldn't get jobs, etc. But the troubles meant that they weren't going to come back. Now they've started to come back. And throughout the troubles, I was always known as an optimist. I genuinely did believe that it would come to an end someday. For the first time in my life, I now consider myself to be a pessimist. We've come through all of this. We seem to have reached a solution, but now politics is totally ossified. And part of it has nothing to do with Northern Ireland. That great historian, Tony Judt, Thinking in the 20th Century, in it, which he published in 2008, shortly before his death, he said, the role of the public intellectual in this century is not to imagine better worlds, but how to avoid worse worlds. And I think that is where we are at. Whether it's Trump in America, Brexit, or what's happening throughout Europe with the dreadful type of identity politics that we have, with the whole migration question, I think we are in a very, very bad place with the whole question of climate, etc. And then transferring that back to Northern Ireland, we have created a political class that is comfortable now in its own right. I do believe we're not going back to violence. Our generation will not go back to violence. I did some teaching in the prisons with political prisoners, and I got to know many of them quite well. And I know what their mindset is. And I know that the hurting stalemate still holds, that this generation does not want to go back to violence because they know the cost of violence. So where we're at, the comfort zone that we're in is now called the negative peace. And some people have done extremely well out of it, and they will continue to live with it. And I don't know how we're going to break out of it, to be perfectly honest.
So I've been in New Zealand for 4 years. I'm not as up to date as I would like to be with events, but the issue of Brexit, which I have followed a little bit, I mean, it's hard to imagine how anyone concerned with peace and the viability of the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland would come up with Brexit. I mean, it is an utter disregarding of that hugely significant solution, remarkably creative solution to a very difficult problem. By no means perfect, and in some ways, some of the ongoing issues are rooted in the fact that it was trying to do so much, but it was creatively trying to do a lot, and it came up with some brilliant solutions. And now Brexit seems to be pulling sharply in the opposite direction. We're promised that a miracle is coming. There's some magical solution which is going to solve the problems of Brexit that it's going to create in Northern Ireland. It seems to me about as plausible as they're going to design a four-sided triangle. We keep waiting to see it happen, but it's hard to see how it is going to happen, and I think that's very discouraging. I suppose the silver lining is possibly it will put the question of a peaceful transition to a united Ireland back on the agenda, because the British government seems to have pushed it sharply in that direction through Brexit.
I think that the Republic of Ireland might have something to say about a united Ireland as well. I'm married to a man from the Republic of Ireland, and my outlaws, as they're called, happen to be visiting at the moment. And of course, the Republic of Ireland had its budget yesterday, the day before. And we were like, oh, are you going to get a good, is it going to be a good one? Are you trying to save some pennies because you're about to get 6 more counties? And they were like, no, we can't afford 6 counties. And that's a reality. Okay, so the British government can push us towards the United Ireland from now to next Tuesday, but the Republic of Ireland have to have a say in it. And whether they have the economics to be able to sustain what would come with 6 counties of Northern Ireland is questionable. Jared, you asked what's the role of the church. I had a look back over an old book written in 96 by Wolf, The Exclusion and Embrace. I'm sure a lot of you guys have read it. And he says that rather than thinking about social arrangements, rather what we have to do is work out what kind of selves we need to be in order to live in harmony. And I think that's where the churches need to come in. I think they need to provide an alternative to the hatred, an alternative to the stalemate, in terms of, this is what mutual respect and understanding looks like.
That's great. Thanks, Lisa. Let's open up now to the floor. And if you could phrase your question succinctly and also say who you are and where you're coming from. And if your question is addressed to a particular speaker, please say, or if it's to the panel in general.
Hi, I'm Connor Gallagher. I did my master's at University of Ulster McGee. I believe I missed you by a year, so I'm sad to have missed you there. But this question's for you as well. You'd mentioned you were in the Labour Party about 50 years ago, and I was just curious as to what things were like on the ground there and how it was between the Catholic and Protestant communities at the time, and if there were, because I feel like that would have been a good bridge builder pre-troubles and a way to kind of bridge that divide, and how that kind of changed or escalated over the tenure of the Troubles?
Well, my neighbourhood was overwhelmingly Catholic, 95% Catholic. I lived in the Bogside. Derry was the heart of gerrymandering in Northern Ireland, where you had a Catholic majority, but from the outset, there was a Protestant unionist council and control because of the gerrymandering. So we didn't have much contact with Protestants. It wasn't encouraged. I went to a junior seminary. I was educated by the Christian Brothers and then at a junior seminary, and that was an incredibly narrow education. And in fact, it drove many of us away from religion, myself included. I only began to address the other community when I took on my first job. I was employed as a teacher of politics in a Protestant grammar school. I was the first and only Catholic who'd gone there. And the headmaster who had asked me to do it did it very, very self-consciously, because he said there needs to be some sort of breakthrough. And if I can get you past my board, will you come to the school? And I said to him, I will go to the school, but and he said, you must commit yourself to 2 years. I said, right, I will do 2 years. But I resigned as soon as I could. Not that what was going on in the school. I think my appointment was, from their point of view, was a very wise one, because I was introducing myself to people from a completely different background who were beginning to get a different concept of what politics was about through someone like me. And that 2 years was my education. I never had a better education than having to deal with the other. And on the back of that, one of the reasons I resigned because I just published my first book, which was in the civil rights movement. And, you know, I needed to get my head below the parapet again because the school was in East Belfast and it wasn't a good place to be. So I got out and then went into higher education. And so what I used my professional life was to try and reach out to the other. I did a huge amount of public commentary, broadcasting and all the rest of it. I did a lot of work for the BBC, for independent television. I wrote for The Guardian, for so many newspapers. I wrote a weekly column for the Irish Times for 2 years. And I used that as my way of getting across the other side. I wrote a second book, which came out in 1980. And the interesting thing about that book was that I began to get, we used to have shoals of American academics every summer who come over to study the problem. And I would be one of the people that they would talk to. And they started telling me, they said, you should go and talk to the Ulster Defence Association. And I said, well, why should I do that? And they said, well, I think that they want to talk to you. And I said, well, why do they want to talk to me? Because their leaders like your book. My attitude was, these guys can't read. You know, these guys, you know, and these are the stereotypes you have. But eventually I did go and talk to them, and the Supreme Commander, as he called himself. And I said, what was it about my book that you liked? And they said, you're the first person from your background who's tried to understand the Protestant working class. Now, I wasn't at all conscious of that I'd done anything like that. And the reason why that came through was because of those 2 years I had in that school. And that was the lesson I learned, that you needed that dialogue, you needed to be talking to the other side, and that's the reason why I went into the prisons to teach political education for some of the prisoners. Because these were the guys who were going to shape the future, for good or for ill. And so it was in our interest to make sure that it was for good. Now that probably doesn't answer your question at all, but it's the nearest I can give you.
Brian. Brian Cahill from the Embassy of Ireland.
Thank you. Brian Cahill from the Embassy of Ireland. Thank you for organising this today, Jared, and it's been a very interesting discussion. Just picking up on a couple of the points and then a question. I mean, first of all, on the point re Brexit, I mean, I think Brexit will be very difficult to manage, but I think a solution will be found, and efforts are continuing to find a solution, because it's not only for the island of Ireland is it of major consequence, it's also for the UK itself and for the EU itself to ensure that that a solution is found to have a managed Brexit that doesn't lead to a hard border on the island of Ireland and all the other consequences that will flow. Secondly, I think it's important to register how much progress Northern Ireland has made since 1998. Obviously, there's still a lot remains to be done, but I think it is important to say that progress has been made. Thirdly, I mean, efforts are continuing to restore the institutions, the Good Friday Agreement institutions. The Taoiseach, or a Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, met with the Secretary of State earlier in the week, and he also met with the Northern Ireland parties with a view to trying to find common ground. And also just to say that the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, made a speech in Derry last weekend on the 50th anniversary of the civil rights movement. It's available at president.ie, and I think it's a very reflective speech, which is well worth a read in terms of the tracing the history of the movement, and of course the influence from here. And on that point, I mean, it strikes me that there was quite a degree of influence from churches here in America. You had the fact that the Roman Catholic Church was very Irish in terms of many of the priests, etc., were Irish American. I mean, less so today. And then also there was a streak of evangelical Protestantism in Northern Ireland, which took inspiration from the wider evangelical Protestant church here. So I was just wondering if there are any reflections on that point, to what extent there was that kind of cross-fertilization, as it were. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Brian, and thanks for the work that you and your colleagues are doing to address precisely those areas around Brexit which are so difficult and not in any way the origin with the Irish government, but a problem you're having to deal with nonetheless. The evangelical organisation that I'm most familiar with in terms of Northern Ireland seeking to offer a positive peace-building presence was the ECONI, the Evangelical Contribution on Northern Ireland. And I don't know for sure, but it certainly makes sense that they might have been influenced by more progressive evangelical organisations here, Sojourners in Washington, D.C., and such like, Ron Sider and others. I think they probably were an inspiration to some extent. I think to get a sort of balanced assessment on what role they had in Northern Ireland, we have to remember that there would have been more conservative evangelical groups which would have been highly critical of them, that they would argue that ECONI, despite its name, was not evangelical, was not making much of a contribution. They might give that they were in Northern Ireland, but only that part of it would they accept. So I would say they punched well above their weight in terms of having a significant evangelical voice and evangelical support, but they also came in for a lot of flack from evangelical organizations like Caleb and more conservative evangelical groups who were highly critical of them. I'm not so familiar on the Catholic side of it, but on the evangelical side, that would be my thoughts on that.
It's a shame Bruce Morrison unfortunately couldn't be with us this afternoon. Hurricanes and another urgent meeting, alas. But Bruce certainly for many years met with church leaders on both sides of the community in Northern Ireland over a sustained period of time. And it was that enabled him to be able to convince President Clinton to get behind the Northern Ireland peace process. So there was a lot of behind the scenes church people who acted as intermediaries. Think people like Alex Reid, for example, the Redemptorist. Irene had a question, I think.
I was waiting too. I'll get in here. Just
Okay, sure.
you discussed the negative piece. I wonder if you could say a bit about the quote peace walls in Belfast, Derry, and that they haven't come down. In contrast to other places like Berlin, where the idea was to bring the walls down. There does not seem to be any momentum for that. And in my last visit there, which was 2014, and interviewing peace builders there, they said, well, we're just trying to get some doors in the walls, but no plans to bring down the so-called peace walls, to your point of negative peace. So I just wondered if you could speak to that. And here's over to Irene.
No, I was going to wait for your answer to hers.
Just on the last question, by the way, I'm not sure that we want any cross-fertilization with churches here. One of our better commentators, Fintan O'Toole, said that the WASPs no longer control the United States. He says it's the Wicks, white Irish Catholics. And this was in relation to the recent promotion to the Supreme Court, where now it seems 6 out of the 9 justices come from that Catholic background. And it's not the sort of Catholicism I would want to recognise. But on the question of the peace walls, we have something like 80 peace walls in Belfast alone. Now, most of them are very badly constructed, but symbolically, it is a classic example of what that negative peace is. We are now trying to talk them down. For example, I think 2025 has been given as a date when they might all come down. There are various social experiments going on, such as the graffiti that goes on those walls. The graffiti now could be someone like George Best, the great footballer. And, the more we get of that, the better. But it is the new normal, and because it is the new normal, people can live with it. And they only will come down when people feel that they have enough faith in the other side. And I think that's happening. And I think one of the things, again, serendipity, the Catholic Church is now in a much weaker place than it ever was. And the classic example of that is the Republic of Ireland and the moral legislation that's come in the Republic of Ireland, which would have been totally unthinkable. The Catholic Church is not now in a position to take a fundamentalist position. And I think that that's for the good. So I think that with time and with, I was going to say with prosperity, but then Brexit entered my head. And that is a huge, I mean, it is impossible to recognize just how damaging this is going to be to all of us. And the people who are most in favor of Brexit, the Democratic Unionist Party, it is that community which will particularly suffer from it. The lack of prosperity is going to make things much more difficult. But if by some miracle Brexit doesn't happen, then I can see things moving fairly rapidly towards a normality where we do trust each other.
Thank you. So the sense seems to be that in 2018, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of civil rights, when indeed some of us would say that it's about 150 years of the civil rights movement, that it's been a long progression here, and that the significance of 1968 were the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, and the emergence of different intersections of the civil rights movement. And notably, the letter from Birmingham jail was 7 months before the assassination of John Kennedy, and 5 years before Martin Luther King's own assassination. In the letter from Birmingham jail, one of the extraordinary statements he made was that he said, we, the leaders of the movement here in the United States, are really extremists. And by the way, so is Jesus the Christ. And so he cast a very different light on what were perceived as they didn't use a term those days, but would have been terrorists. So the distinction between terrorist and freedom fighter was interesting. And one of the things that was really happening in 1968 was an extraordinary convergence of people from many different religions. So it wasn't just Dorothy Day and the Barracan brothers from the Catholic Church. It was Walter Fauntroy, Baptist right here in Washington, D.C. And by the way, Father Ray Kemp here at Georgetown, who was very involved with the African Catholic Church, African American Catholic Church in Washington. So there was a real convergence and a focus on not just civil rights, but social justice. And some would say that we've gone far afield from that, but that that's an issue in Northern Ireland, basic social economic justice, and in the Republic as well. And I wonder if you could speak to the role of the church in social justice.
I think one of the things that I was thinking about this week, actually, in preparation for this, that struck me about how, growing up, in my head, the civil rights space was for the Catholics. It wasn't where Protestants found themselves. To your points from earlier on. But that doesn't mean that Protestants weren't in the social justice space. And they still are. So they're still feeding the poor and standing up for the orphan and for the widow. And organisations like Habitat for Humanity, for example, live and well in Belfast, building houses for everybody from all sorts of the community. And so social justice is not, interestingly, doesn't necessarily have a sectarian bent to it in Belfast, which actually gives me some kind of hope, because it's an equaliser, isn't it? And it's a space perhaps of a superordinate goal that perhaps we could actually work together on.
So just to draw to a close, we started a couple of minutes late, so I think we have time for this one. All three of you have been involved in educational initiatives, cross-community educational initiatives in Ireland. Very different types as well, at school level, at a graduate degree level, at undergraduate degree level, working with communities, prisoners. What are you proudest of in your educational work? Where did you see real breakthrough moments that you still look back to and feel pride and a source of hope?
I would say two things. My 2 years teaching in that particular school I was in, but secondly was in 1987, a number of us came together and said we're going to run a master's program in peace studies. At that stage there was no sign at all that peace would break out, but we worked on the basis that peace would come someday, and we needed a community that was educated for peace. So when we started our MA in Peace Studies in 1987, we deliberately went out seeking certain constituency, clergy, educators, trade unionists, etc., because they are going to be the leaders of tomorrow, and they need to have some understanding of the vocabulary that will be necessary to move things. So I take great pride in that.
For me, it was a very windy, wet weekend in Newcastle, County Down, with youth leaders, both Protestant and Catholic, from Portadown, and sitting around the table, wrestling with how we were going to handle, how they were going to handle in their communities, prevalence of drugs for their young people. And it was that moment of magic where it was like it didn't matter what community you were from. This was a threat to our two communities that only working together we could sort it out. And it gives such hope that the bread and butter issues of politics could at some day supersede our sectarian, territorial tendencies.
So we were lucky that many of our students were working in very practical work. Our program was an academic program. It wasn't a practical program as such, but we worked with students who were doing very practical work. And I remember after one session where the police commander for West Belfast, who was responsible for the decisions that the police made around policing a parade and the demonstration against the parade, came to work with our students for a morning and told us afterwards that he planned to police the parade differently on account of the conversations that we had had in class. Not that there had been any great sort of genius insights that we'd shared, but he'd come to see that his understanding of the police as a neutral party, the umpire and fair play person in this, was not how the Catholic community saw it. And he at least had to take on board that that's not how they were seen by one of the parties. And therefore, he told us that was going to make a difference to the way the summer parades in West Belfast, at least in his mind, were going to be handled. And that was a great moment for us with the programme.
Fantastic. Well, those are three very uplifting stories to end on. We've had some fascinating insights this afternoon. Please join me in thanking all three of our speakers. You may know, but not all perhaps, that this conference is the second of two conferences and the first of a long-running research project on religions and exiting violence. And the engine for this, of course, comes from the research project started by Professor Deborah Tonelli, who you heard speak yesterday, and her project on exiting violence, and the Fondazione Bruno Kessler in Trento in the north of Italy. And last year's first conference was held in Trento in Italy, where we looked at texts and traditions in relation to religion and violence. And it's my great pleasure here to offer some thanks, but also who's going to share with us some further reflections about the work of the Fondazione and this wider project, Professor Marco Ventura, who is the director of the Fondazione Bruno Kessler, the Center for Religious Studies there, and is also Professor of Law and Canon Law at the University of Siena. So please, Professor.
Thank you so much. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to say a few words at the end of our to today's. And I would like, first of all, to express my gratitude to the Berkley Center for this partnership, and to Director Sean Casey, to Jose Casanova, Gerard Mannion, and the friends, those who were in Trento last year, those who might have the opportunity to meet here for the first time. I would also like to thank Giancarlo Bosetti and Reset for the partnership. This was a three-party game, and something which has not been said so far is that Giancarlo should be credited, in fact, with the expression exiting violence. It comes from a conversation we had. We were discussing about which title to give to the project, and this was his idea. And again, Gerard did that already, but let me thank Deborah Tonelli for her fundamental work. She's been leading a project on religion and violence in our center in Trento, and without her, this would have never been possible. So thank you so much. I'd like to say a couple of things on a more substantial note. One refers to what I take away from our exercise from these two days, and which I would describe in terms of a rich and fruitful articulation of scholarship and engagement. And a second thing I would like also to stress is the value of agency, which has been underlined all throughout the several panels and presentations. Now, scholarship and engagement. I think I have this impression at the end of the 2 days that it's been very rich, it's been very diverse, it's been very analytical, many different backgrounds, many different methodological options. It's been very rich. But indeed, at the end, it is possible to say that there was a common grammar. There was a common grammar. There was a common methodology. So for how diverse the exercise, I had the impression that something came up out of the shared work. And this was probably already there in the work of each of us from the very beginning and in the work of our respective institutions, but I also have the impression that this was somehow enriched and consolidated, panel after panel, presentation after presentation, discussion after discussion. I'm very grateful for this. Now, when I think of this positive and promising articulation of scholarship and engagement, I believe that this comes down to some more specific articulations. One is terminology. Many speakers have pointed at the importance of working on the category of violence. What do we mean by violence? Gerard mentioned I have a legal background, so when we work on violence and religion, our task is first of all to come up with a very detailed list of what qualifies as violence in terms of violation of religious freedom, for instance, or violations from states. States violating their obligations under international law, for instance. So and there was a lot during the workshop which helped us working at that level in identifying different forms of violence even better. But then there's another level in terms of understanding violence better, and that was the contribution that the group, if I may speak like that, gave in terms of different forms of violence, shifting boundaries of violence, cultural violence, psychological violence, and even, I remember from a panel yesterday, some question about conflicts and different notions of conflicts. So which conflicts could be recognized to some extent as a positive conflict. So we discussed terminology a lot, and I think that there was a very positive contribution which was given to the very work on terminology. This is very important, as we tend to, as always, use certain terms more than in others. I've just been notified that I'm the recipient of a EU grant for a research project on security. I'm not sure that I would have had that grant from the European Union if I had used the term peace or the term violence, whereas the term security worked. And of course, that belongs to the specific terminology where the call for application is drafted, right? And that belongs to the terminology of the political conversation, but it is never innocent, okay? It is never innocent. So the fact that we had the courage to engage with the term violence and leave for a moment security on the side, I also found this very, very important in terms of what we can contribute to the public conversation. One more thing on the notion of violence and religion as scholarship and engagement is past, present, and future. Past, present, and future. This is also something which didn't apply only to the last panel on Ireland, but this was a very important way of making space for, again, an articulation of more scholarly work, and engagement at the same time, when we look at how to make sense of the past in view of engaging with future responsibilities. Now, there's another aspect, probably the last one I want to underline, of exiting violence, which is, at the end of the 2 days, very positive in my eyes. And that's the fact that we were able to not to be limited to religion and violence, not to be too much limited by the theme. This is what happens sometimes with workshops, that finally the keywords which have been selected by organizers become a sort of straitjacket. They limit the conversation. They make the topic narrow. Well, I had the opposite sense here, that we were constantly able to travel beyond the boundaries of religion and violence and look at the broad picture, look at the many factors, look at the many actors involved. So this was really a multi-factor and multi-actor conversation. Now I come to my second point. And my second point is the notion of responsibility. In my work at the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation of Europe, where I'm a member of the panel of experts on religious freedom, it's 14 of us, and one of them is Heiner Bielefeld, who has been for some years the special rapporteur for the United Nations on freedom of religion or belief. When he was in office in 2014, Heiner contributed a fantastic report on violence in the name of religion. Great reading, very, very rich and clear. And there is a point which I would like to share with you this afternoon, which is about the struggle with finding the appropriate place and role of religion in discussions on violence. And Heiner makes the point that it's difficult and necessary to avoid overestimating the role of religion and underestimating the role of religion. So religion should never be recognized as an isolated cause for violence, as the only factor. And at the same time, religion should never be underestimated, especially for the sake of condoning what individuals and communities do in the name of religion. What I particularly appreciate in this argument with Hannah Bielefeld's report, that this argument is made as a preliminary argument in coming then to a fundamental point about the role of agency and responsibility. Allow me to share a very brief quote here. I quote, "It is always human beings in their various roles and positions who remain the responsible agents for any justifications and commission of violence." End of quote. So a strong call on agency and responsibility. And again, if I can come to my previous point, I see this also as a way to make sense of our exercise with scholarship and engagement. Scholarship and engagement, agency and responsibility. Now, when I was preparing myself to the workshop, I was already thinking of sharing this quote with you, but that was, of course, out of the context. That is what we do before a workshop, right? We think of what we might contribute without really knowing then what we will go through in the conversation. So my sense today at the end of our workshop is that this quote, this accent of agency and responsibility makes sense even more than before for me personally. So it made sense before, it made sense as a very important contribution in the supranational conversation, in the transatlantic conversation. Now I have a feeling that it makes sense even more as the result of our shared endeavor in these 2 days. Thank you very much.